Hello and welcome to my final project. I decided to do a media project because I really enjoyed how the last one turned out in Notes 9 that we did, and I feel like I can explain my theory better in this setup with pictures and me talking about it in person, whereas in an essay it's not as interactive for the audience, and here I can have pictures and really illustrate what I'm trying to get across in my point. I set this up mostly with a main topic title slides, followed by brief points alternating between the 1920s and then the movie, which is my theory. The Shining is the Roaring Twenties. I probably should explain that in the beginning. And then after my points, I have pictures that kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, both from the movie, which you'll see here on the right side of the screen, and then both from like the 1920s, so we can see a comparison. And hopefully it moves forward. Alright. Let's start first with a little introduction. I decided to choose the Roaring Twenties as my theory because many aspects of the 20s honestly just jumped out at me as I was watching the movie. And the scene that I remember most clearly is the party scene, which is the picture on the right here that took place in the Gold Room, and it's all 1920s themed. And when I was watching the movie, like the scene that instantly came to mind was the movie The Great Gatsby with the 20s theme and then the party there. I saw a lot of similarities jumping back from like modernity and the time period of the 20s. So I have a little comparison here. We have the picture from The Shining here on the right with the 20s theme party, and then we have a picture of a party from the 1920s, so you can kind of get a sense of how they're similar. Right, next I have some character roles and character parallels, and what we can consider each character from the movie stands for in terms of the 20s. So we'll start with Jack. Jack is the old-fashioned conservative male view that he likes things done very traditionally, and he likes to be the breadwinner for the family. He's seen as the head of the household, and he's a very firm patriarch. He treats Wendy as inferior. So I have him as the traditional conservative male view of the 1920s. He didn't like the rebellion kind of happening and the transition in social and cultural views. And next I have Wendy, and Wendy is the rebellious flapper girl, which is what a lot of the style, this is where we get the 1920s style and dress, for they're called flappers. She wants to break free from the traditional ways and from Jack in hopes of finding equality and freedom, and this is seen a lot more in the book than in the movie, where she says she secretly wants divorce and she doesn't like how Jack treats Danny, and she really isn't happy where she's at. And it's reflected whenever she talks about her mother, and her mother doesn't approve of Jack and how she thinks like Wendy isn't successful in her marriage and that she should leave. Right. And evidence for these can be seen when she fights against Jack to escape, and then also, like I said in the book, when she secretly deep down wants a divorce. And next is the role of not just Danny, but children in general in the movie. And children in the 1920s and in the movie can be seen as awake, I have in quotes. They know the truth about things, and they're forced to kind of grow up faster due to their situations. Danny acts so much like an adult in the movie, and so do the little girls here. And then children of the 1920s were forced to grow up in terms of child labor. They were forced to go out and earn a living for their family. And this is seen especially in the movie through the Grady twins, when Grady says that in the movie, and when he's talking to Jack in the bathroom, Grady says that one of his twins even tried to take a match and burn the hotel down, and that means like they know the truth of, like they know what's happening and they know what's going on and they know the truth about things. And this is also seen with Danny in his Shining, and like they see that the hotel is evil, whereas the adults might not recognize that right away, and they're trying to make things right. Here I have some picture parallels with Jack at the Bar and some speakeasies of the 1920s. I thought these were really interesting. And I honestly just found these on Google Images from the 1920s, and they looked so similar to the scenes from the movie. I had to include them so you guys could see. That was pretty cool. Alright, now we get into the good stuff, and that's the main ideas and the main points of my theory. The first piece of evidence that I have is that of the changing role of women, both in the movies and both in the movie The Shining, and the 1920s. And this is how women are treated and portrayed in both the movie and in the 20s. So the 20s, just a little background, was a huge time for women and women's rights. It was absolutely just a revolutionary time for women and equality. Women gained the right to vote in the 1920s. They could finally have a say in how they were governed and how they wanted things to be run. They also began to have more freedom with how they dressed. They didn't have to be as conservative. They didn't have to cover up, and they could express themselves more openly. You see a lot of dresses like down here with the flapper style coming more above the knee, where they couldn't really show anything above the ankle really before, or mid-shin. It had to cover the knee, and you couldn't have your shoulders out, but you have more of a freedom and expression in this new dress, which helps symbolize the equality of the time. And this is where we, like I said, get that iconic 1920s flapper look from. Women were viewed as more independent, and they didn't necessarily need a male escort everywhere, as it used to be improper for a lady to go out without a man. She couldn't just go out by herself. She always had to be escorted somewhere, and women who were seen without a man were looked down upon. And so they didn't need that anymore in the 20s. They could go out and be independent. Women also gained more sexual freedom. Birth control became more common, and it was more well respected. And women could choose, now with the popular use of birth control, women could choose when to have kids, how many they wanted, and they weren't really controlled by their husbands or men anymore. They could really have a say in how they wanted their families to be and over their sexual preferences. And The Shining really reflects these changes. Wendy becomes more rebellious throughout the course of the book and the movie. She kind of starts out as being submissive, and then throughout the book and the movie she really starts to stand up for herself and for Danny and what she wants, and ends up in the end saving them both. So she fights against Jack and escapes out from under both Jack and the hotel's control, which was also controlled by Grady's patriarchal ideas. And the party represents the freedom of women in the 1920s. The party in the gold room I'm referring to. I kind of jumped there. The party represents the freedom of women. And they were allowed to go out, drink, dance, party without a man, and they didn't need an escort. And there were also sexual images throughout the hotel, mainly the woman in room 237 that kind of suggests the sexual freedom of the time for women, as shown by the nude woman in room 237, which is pictured here. So I just have the woman from 237, votes for women, flapper girl, and then Wendy pushing Jack down the stairs, kind of symbolizing the rebellion and women pushing back against men and fighting for their rights and for their families. The next piece of evidence I have is about prohibition, which is a really big part of both The Shining and the 1920s, and this could really even be a theory by itself, that The Shining is about prohibition or alcohol. Alcohol plays a huge part in both the story The Shining and powers many of the character decisions and plays deeply into the plot of the story. The first point I have is in regards to connections and prohibition between the 20s and The Shining, is the fact that alcohol was outlawed. The U.S. outlaws alcohol in the 20s, and Jack, in a sense, outlaws alcohol from his life by deciding to become sober, after hurting Danny and obtainment of alcohol. So he decides to become sober after hurting Danny in the incident he had at school with the little boy at his school in his car when he lost his temper after he'd been drinking and lost his job. So the next point refers to the illegal obtainment of alcohol, which happens both in the 20s and The Shining. Speakeasies are underground illegal bars that were created in the 20s as a way to illegally obtain alcohol, and people drank even when they weren't supposed to. Jack, in a sense, goes to a speakeasy when he meets Lloyd at the bar in the Gold Room after having a fight with Wendy and being upset with her, and he ends up drinking even when he's not supposed to, and even when the alcohol is said to be off premises, which is very similar to the 1920s with the speakeasies. The alcohol was illegal, and you weren't supposed to be drinking, but it happened anyway. I consider him to be at a speakeasy because, number one, he is drinking alcohol illegally, and number two, he is the only one who is able to see the fully stocked bar. And we see this when Wendy comes in, it disappears exactly like the speakeasies of the 20s when the cops came around. They just kind of disappeared in both the movies. When Wendy came around, kind of symbolizing the cops, they both disappeared. So, and the speakeasies disappeared when the cops came, and the bar that Jack had been drinking at disappeared when Wendy came in. And the final point I have about Prohibition is the reason that alcohol was banned from both the US in the 20s and Jack from his life. In the 20s, alcohol was banned because it was thought to increase criminal activity, led to social problems, and eventually to corruption. It was also thought to be the reason why there were so many poor people and so many people in prisons. And this is from one of my sources, Mark Thornton's article, Alcohol Prohibition Was a Failure, which I have later in my work cited. This is exactly what happens to Jack in The Shining when he begins drinking. He starts to have ideas about killing his family, which relates to the criminal activity. He starts to lash out at his family, which symbolizes the social problems, and it makes him hurt Danny and forget about his job as caretaker, and that hints at the corruption of alcohol. Drinking proves to be Jack's ultimate downfall, because this is how the hotel possesses him in the end and makes him lose his family. So alcohol in the 1920s, like I said, was thought to bring on all these corruption and criminal activity, and in The Shining you can see this reflected, that when Jack starts drinking, he starts hurting people, he starts lashing out, he forgets about his job, and it really is just a downhill spiral, and the hotel possesses him, and that's where things really start to pick up. The next slide I have here is about the idea of rebellion from authority. This is another key idea in the 20s that translates over to The Shining. The whole idea of the Roaring Twenties speaks to this as a new revolution of ideas and a new way of life. So people were constantly fighting for the rights and the freedoms in the 20s. And people were fighting prohibition, people were fighting against the idea that women were only wives and mothers, and this is seen in the fashion as flappers. Women fought for equality. They didn't want to be just wives and mothers. They wanted to be seen as people, and people with rights and who had ideas, and they weren't just seen as like somebody's wife, somebody's mother, like no one knew their name, they were just Mrs. or the mom of their child. So they were really fighting for equality here. And in general, people fought the uptight, older, conservative ways of society with new music, which is why the 20s is called the Jazz Age, and dancing and new dress in which they could express themselves. So it was really, truly a cultural and social revolution in a way. People were trying to be less uptight and like keeping to themselves. They were trying to be more open and expressive, and they were trying to come in with new ideas, and there was a big like fight back and forth between the conservatives and of the time and the new people, the younger, most stereotypically the younger generation, who wanted things to be different. And in The Shining, there's just as much of you can see just as much rebellion in this. There's a fight fought by Wendy and Danny of the patriarchy and Grady's old-fashioned view that men must discipline their wives and children, which is the idea that Grady passed on to Jack in the bathroom, and this is the reason why Jack tries to murder his family. Because when Grady is talking to Jack in the bathroom during the 1920s party after he spills drinks onto Jack, he says that whenever his wife and his children would get ideas of their own or try to go against Grady's wish, and he would have to discipline them, which he passes on to Jack. And Wendy and Danny were fighting that view, and the view of men as the source of income for the family is really turned upside down when Wendy takes over Jack's job as caretaker while he writes, in quotes, aka that means he goes crazy. And this also challenges the damsel in distress storyline, especially when Halloran tries to save them in the movie, but he's killed, meaning that men can't really save you all the time. So Wendy and Danny really had to fight for themselves, and Wendy had to fight for what she wanted. And the pictures I have here are of them escaping here in the end, and then of course the excuse me, woman being more rebellious, and then Wendy taking over Jack's job over here, which I just explained. Okay, so in the end, Wendy does leave Jack, symbolizing the leaving behind of the old conservative ideas of the 20s, and she escapes with Danny for a new life, symbolizing the new equality and newfound rights for everyone in the 20s, the new expression, new equality especially for women, and just ditching of the old, uptight ways that suppressed a lot of people. Right. Another point I have is that The Shining is really about the economic growth of the 1920s, And in the 1920s, there was an economic boom. The stock market was booming, there was huge amounts of industrial growth and a lot of technological advances. Cars really became more affordable and more popular, sales increased, wages increased, and the production of consumer goods increased, and people began to be able to afford luxuries like cars and radios and television. They really became more popular instead of just like a small population of people owning these things like the really rich. And they became more common and families could start to afford them. Overall, it was the highest standard of living, which is the poster up here, and the best time economically speaking to be alive. This economic growth is carried over into The Shining, and this is seen when the Torrances moved to the Overlook. They transitioned from relative poverty, Jack being unemployed, they didn't really have a lot of money, to a place of wealth, and they started living a wealthier lifestyle. The hotel's well stocked with like any type of food imaginable. They have endless amounts of food and pantry space and fridges. The kitchen's huge. When they get a tour on Wendy saying, I'll need a map to find my way around the kitchen, like she won't even use half the stuff, but this goes to symbolize the wealth they have. And they have like silver trays, which highlights the wealth, and Jack also has increased wages. He goes from nothing to employed. The family now has money. They have luxuries like food, which I said earlier, furniture, rooms, television, radio, and money. They are essentially at the highest standard of living that they ever have been as a family, which is where the 1920s comes into play. And they're happy in the beginning until the fall, which is much like the stock market crash of 1929, marking a new era. And I have the photo parallels down here with the radio from the 20s with Wendy using the radio, and television in the 20s with Wendy using the television. Next is a little explanation of the line, all work and no play, which my dad quotes a lot. That's probably his favorite quote from the entire movie, and I'll come down in the kitchen. He's just, all work and no play, all the time. In 1920s terms, all work symbolizes the old conservative ways and those that work all the time. No self-expression, it's always all business, it's always serious. And Jack falls into this category like I explained earlier in the character roles. He's seen as the old conservative type in the 1920s. He's concerned most with his reputation at work and is obsessed with his work, so much so that when he realizes that his family does not agree with him on this, as they are of the playing category, he tries to murder them. This work makes Jack a dull boy, in quote, as stated in the movie, which means he is of the older, dull, in quote, conservative class. Wendy and Danny, as I mentioned above, are of the playing category. In 1920s, this would symbolize the flappers, the leaders and supporters of the change happening. They are more open-minded than Jack, and they look for out-of-the-box solutions to problems. They're willing to fight against Jack and the patriarchy view in order to gain a better life for themselves, which leads to the destruction of Jack and the hotel in the end, symbolizing the death of the old 1920s patriarchal conservative view. So right here I have some flappers dancing the Charleston, which was a popular dance of the time, on ice, and then I have the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy from the movie. And the last idea that I have is that of the adaptiveness to change, or that of self-transformation and growth. The 1920s was a huge test of self-reinvention, and people really had to be willing to keep open minds and willing to take a look at themselves and really reevaluate their identity and decide what was most important for them. Closed-minded people struggled the most in the 20s because they were not willing to accept the new change happening or listen to new ideas, even though change was and still is inevitable. This is seen clearly in The Shining with Wendy, Danny, and Halloran, who shine even if just a little bit in Wendy's case. As stated in the book, Halloran senses that Wendy has something about her. It's not quite a shine strong enough like Halloran or Danny, but she's more aware than most people. And so these three characters shine, and they're seen as more, I believe they're shining, like it's seen as being able to see the change happening and being able to adapt to the change and come up with a plan to meet the challenge, and they're able to keep an open mind and really come up with a better solution and meet the new challenge of I can't think of the words, but their shine means overall just that they're more open-minded and they're able to recognize change and go with it, kind of roll with it and embrace it. That's the word I'm looking for. Jack and Grady were ultimately killed due to their closed-mindedness, and that's because they didn't shine. They didn't have a shine about them, which means that they couldn't adapt to change. So basically, shining means their ability to adapt to change, to recognize change, and to be willing to embrace it. So Jack and Grady were not willing to change themselves or relook at themselves. It was either like their views were right and everyone else was wrong or an enemy, and so they had to go against everyone else, which is why they were seen as the enemies, because it was basically their way or the highway, to put it in common terms. They tried to force others to change, and they weren't willing to change themselves. Overall, The Shining is clearly about the 1920s. There were many parallels, like I said, you can see in the pictures and many of the ideas with the changing role of women and gaining equality with Wendy and Danny leaving, and then the women of the 1920s fighting for the right to vote and the right to be seen as independent and equal. And prohibition is paralleled in The Shining in the 1920s with Jack outlawing alcohol and alcohol being outlawed in the 20s, but a lot of people drink anyway in both the 20s, and Jack drinks anyway in the movie, and that promotes a lot of corruption, which it was the idea behind outlawing alcohol in the 20s in the first place, and ultimately alcohol drives Jack to kill his family and be possessed by the hotel. Rebellion from authority is echoed in both, with, again, the women and a lot of people fighting for equality, and Wendy and Danny fighting for this equality and coming out from under the patriarchy. Economic growth is also paralleled in the movie and the 20s, because the 20s was seen as the highest standard of living, and the Torrances were at their peak of highest standard of living. They had luxuries, they had food, they had money. They went from no employment to being fully employed and paid. And next is the all work and no play categorizations, where the all work symbolized the old conservative ways, and the play categorization symbolized the new ways of the 20s, and this includes Wendy and Danny, and Jack and Grady are considered the all work category and the closed-minded conservative. And then the last idea is the adaptation to change being The Shining. So if you had a shine to you in Stephen King's book The Shining or in the movie The Shining, you were able to keep an open mind and recognize change and being able to adapt to that change really easily. So overall, I hope you enjoyed my presentation and my theory that The Shining was about the 1920s. I had a lot of fun putting it together, and I think it was really interesting. And the last slide I have is just my works cited. And so this is all the articles I referenced and used to help my research. And thank you for listening.